personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest all the way from Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, Moiz Baig. He is a Cybersecurity Advisor for Nokia. Welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. So you and I connected on LinkedIn. I love your name. And I was really excited about some of the things that you do and also the things that you comment on LinkedIn. So I would love for you to give a bit of your background in cybersecurity and how you ended up in this career path.
Sure. So as I've been in telecoms, or I would say generally networking for over 20 years now. I've had a passion for technology growing up. My father was more of a mechanical engineer, used to tear cars apart and build them back again. I don't think the mechanical aspect was that much appealing to me, but just the engineering aspect was quite appealing. And growing up in the age of satellite communication and satellite television, I think just the idea of having to be able to communicate across the world using these domains was something that I thought was really exciting. So that's how I stumbled upon I was undergraduate in electrical engineering with a focus on telecommunication. And the rest, as I say, is history. In short, I've had about a little over 20 years worth of experience. Started off my career more on the networking side, coming from a core network / an IP network background, where I was responsible for some of the early 3G networks and also to a certain extent 2G networks on building the backbone connectivity. Later on, have been part of some of the early 3G rollouts that were happening, the third generation mobile communication, both in Europe and North America, before moving over to the region here, where the focus has been more on services. And for the past almost 4 or 5 years, I've been pretty much eating, breathing, and sleeping cybersecurity as a topic because, as we know, with the advent of things like 5G, network virtualization, it is becoming a very, very important topic. And I personally thought that while connectivity is great, I think there's an aspect of security and data privacy that needs to be brought into the picture. So in short, kind of that has been my journey. And that's how I landed up in cybersecurity.
That's great. Oh, wow. Well, you and I have something in common. So my father also was a mechanical engineer. And that's why I think I like to tear things apart and break them.
Likewise. Absolutely. Yeah.
I want your thought about 5G. It's so funny. So when you hear people talk about certain technologies when they come out, there's this obvious hype cycle that happens where people are talking about that one topic at that one moment a lot, right? And then people get interested in the next shiny thing and then they forget about it. So I've heard people say, well, 5G is over with. It's not going to happen. I'm like, do you know nothing about technology whatsoever? Tell me what's happening right now.
Right. So I totally agree with you, Debbie. Look, I think technology to most people, I think it's about what use cases or what problems it is actually solving for them, correct? So coming from a background, I think both of us have seen the dial-up internet times and then some of the early deployments on the mobile networks, the second generation, the CDMA, then 3G and 4G, where these speeds have been relatively increasing. In my view, I would say the inflection point has been the creation of iPhone, right? I mean, in 2007 and 8, when Steve Jobs came up with this brand new device that looked like an iPod, but had a lot more options. So most of the people like ourselves who were used to the Motorola Razr phones or the Nokia brick phones, which were great phones with our Tetris games and playing snakes and all that. But that really changed the entire ecosystem on how people would use this device on a daily basis for a multitude of applications. So that use case drives, I think, a lot of innovation in that space and also drive the connectivity. And I tell a lot of people, if it was not for Steve Jobs, I think the 3G networks would have been a graveyard, right? Because the use cases weren't there. I mean, there were a lot of companies testing things like video conferencing or video calling in 3G, but really there was no killer use case. So in short, I think that was a big inflection point in our technology domain where we see a huge uptake of people really connecting in a way they had never done before. What has happened since then with 4G LTE and now 5G is it has taken a multi-fold, I would say, increase in terms of what applications can be brought into play. So to your question, Debbie, what is happening with 5G? I think that is a multi-billion dollar question that most CEOs are asking on a daily basis because look at the US, for example, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, and so forth. We have the other markets. They have invested a lot of money to meet the requirements for the licenses, which they got to roll out the 5G networks. They have spent a lot of money with the vendors like Nokia, Ericsson, and some of the others to deploy these sort of networks. And at the end of the day, I think there's still a big question mark on how they monetize these networks. I mean, where is money coming from, right? Then there's been this whole debate about the OTT players, which is the over-the-top players who are coming in with their applications, be it the likes of WhatsApp or Telegram or Facebook, and kind of using the pipe connectivity that is being provided by these, I would say, operators, be it on a 4G or a 5G network, and take their revenue share away from them. Having said that, there has also, with being 5G, a lot of talk about use cases in the industry 4.0, which means how do you digitalize traditional industries like agriculture, like healthcare, transportation, with things like smart cities, with things like dedicated network slices or use cases on ports or in certain factories to drive automation. And I think that's where the low latency, which we talk about in layman words, is the time it would take for you to send a request from your phone and the response you get back has been the lowest in 5G. So besides the great speeds that we get, it's also the lower latency of 5G, which has been driving a lot of these use cases using sensors in the things we wear, or watches, or glasses, or devices we use at home, or cars that are not connected. So I think that has really driven that ecosystem. But if you ask me honestly, I think that killer use case is still somewhere on the horizon. And I think that would really drive the mass adoption of 5G in a way which it was intended to. Because otherwise, it basically becomes AG, like you said, as a technology, which may give you an access to download a Netflix movie in 10 seconds compared to a couple of minutes in LTE. But besides that, I think it really, really needs that strong driver. And we've been talking on a lot of domains on that, and I'd be happy to share more details on where we see 5G going in the future.
Absolutely. I work on a lot of use cases around IoT. Maybe IoT and 5G suffer from the same problem where there was this huge hype cycle and people got excited about the new shiny thing and they're like, oh, IoT is over. I'm like, well, that's everything that we're doing right now. Thinking about all the smart devices and things like that. And so I tell people these new innovations, what they're doing is creating more capability for people to be able to connect things to the internet and do things that they weren't able to do yet. But I agree that there isn't sort of that one use case that just blows everything out of the water. Maybe it'll be just a bunch of little niche use cases.
Precisely.
That combined together will create a huge impact. But I think the sleeping giant, in my view, is probably IoT and the way people are using it. Like you gave an example about smart cities. That's something I work on as well. I walk around, I drive around, I'm seeing like more devices on poles and different things the cities are trying to do that maybe people aren't paying attention. And maybe that's good. Maybe it's good that people feel like their city operates in a way that is not intrusive to them. But then also that brings in a lot of cyber and privacy issues as well. What do you think?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that, Debbie. And IoT as a topic is very close to my heart. So I think something I didn't mention in the beginning is I took about a 2-year career break in 2013 and 14, where I was so excited about IoT and at that time machine to machine or the M2M as we used to call it, that I thought that is a domain to work in. And I kind of went on and signed up a couple of companies which I was representing as a channel partner here in the region, and also developing some of the use cases. So it was still early days. And like you said, we'd been hearing multiple numbers, 50 billion devices by 2020, 100 billion by X amount. But I think we have adopted IoT in a way we don't really recognize it. And in context of smart cities, the things we use on a daily basis, be it the Apple Watch or be it the trackers that we have in our health scales or be it, things like Alexa, these have become so integrated in our daily lives that we don't even think twice about, okay, is this really a secure device? I mean, who else has access to my Alexa recordings? Is this device listening to my conversations with my kids or my spouses? Or when I go out and I have all this data on my electric car, where's that data going? So we have kind of adopted that in a way where we embraced it like anything else. And I think the disclaimers that most companies put out there with the data, I think it's more about what are you opting in versus opting out, right? I think that's where you talk a lot about how this data is being used, to what level it needs to be restricted, what are some of the frameworks and regulations that need to be in there. And as we talk about AI and other things coming into play, I mean, it's going to be a very, very interesting, at the same time, a difficult proposition, both from a consumer perspective as well as from these companies who are offering these services. How do they ensure the data privacy? You, I think, in your recent podcast, talk about what's happening in California, which is probably one of the most mature states when it comes to regulating these, right? But again, I mean, there are more countries that need to probably embrace something similar and do it at a national level, state level, and have this private public enterprise, I would say, partnerships that needs to really work together to be able to make sure we don't have a scenario where we have a massive data breach or we have other civil lawsuits happening down the road, because both me and I mean, the writing has been on the wall for a while, and I think we're just lucky we don't see at that scale, but it's probably a matter of time, right?
Absolutely. Well, the thing that you brought up about IoT in general makes me think about the symbiotic relationship between privacy and cybersecurity. Give me your thoughts about how those two domains work together.
Right. If you would allow me, I'll talk in context of what my domain is, which is mostly working with, the telecom, or like we call it now, the mission critical networks, because they are regarded as the critical infrastructure of any nation, right? And traditionally speaking, in the early days where we had these networks which were very close boxes, like 2G, 3G, and to a certain extent 4G as well, where they had a lot of proprietary, I would say, controls regulated by some of the regulations like 3GPP and GSMA in how they would store the user data, how they would get access to certain parts of the network. The use cases were very few. So you could probably have a voice call or send an SMS or do a fax or something of that sort, but there was very few cases. So the whole ecosystem was a very close in terms of who gets access to it. And the threat landscape was very, very left. What has happened in the advent of 4.5G, and now 5G is the whole concept of open RAN, multiple vendors coming in, the cloudification, and in context of IoT, devices that may not be following a certain standard getting access to your network, right? So how do you ensure the privacy of these users who are part of your network, and how do you want to secure them? So the older ways of assuming that you have a black box network, and to a certain extent, you put some firewalls on the perimeter, and you hope that nothing goes wrong. I mean, that approach is no longer working. When we talk to our customers, when we talk to our mission critical networks that we are servicing, one of the top concern is, what is the threat landscape? I mean, do I really know what devices are looking to access my network? Are they following a certain standard? How do I know there is not an employee who has left the company is getting access to my network? I mean, how do I manage that, access control to the critical network elements of my sort of network? So this whole topic of cybersecurity governance come into play, where you're not only expected to secure this expanding threat landscape, but you're also expected to make sure that your in-house cybersecurity hygiene is up to the mark. You have the right policies, you have the right people, process, and tools, and you have the right training for your own your employees. Because as both me and Debbie, about 70% of these incidents happen because of insider threat, right? Because of employees not following a certain, I would say, policy, or the passwords being left on sticky notes, or the same password being shared by 3 or 4 users or your third-party contractors who you give access to for a certain time. So this whole concept of zero trust becomes more and more important. So to give you a short answer and just to like sum it up, I think the data privacy and cybersecurity goes very strongly hand in hand, as we both appreciate that. But in context of 5G, it becomes more important because of the facts that I've mentioned. And I think it's about making your own house in order, making sure you have the right processes that you need to follow. You need to have the right strategy to like train your people. And of course, you need to have the right tool set. I mean, there are a plethora of tools out there that can help you solve certain use cases, but a tool is only as good as what you put it to. So I think if you are looking to really have this interlinking of cybersecurity and data privacy, and you are not going to be hoping to be exposed to certain breaches, which we are still seeing in mature countries, right? You need to make sure that your cybersecurity hygiene is in check and you are ensuring the data that you are, collecting from your users is safe and secure, which is going to be a difficult challenge as we go in this 5G and IoT journey.
I agree. I want your thoughts on something that I feel that has been happening since the very beginning of the internet days and how people use data. And this is, to me, one of the biggest issues that we have in privacy and cybersecurity. And it is the notion that people are creating security through obscurity, right? So it used to be like, well, no one's going to do that. We're going to create this one little path that the users can go on, and no one's going to go look outside. No one's going to travel off the path, right? And so what we have now is so many more capabilities we didn't have before. And so if we're still thinking about using security through obscurity, it really doesn't work. In my view, that's also one of the reasons why people have a challenge around cryptography because they think, okay, well, you go on the website and say, okay, your password is strong and it won't be cracked in like 5,000 years or, something like that. But then when you get quantum computing, it doesn't follow those rules now. So it can do that in like 3 seconds instead of thousands of years. So what is your thoughts about security through obscurity and the challenges there?
Yeah, no, you bring up a very, very valid point. I think typically companies, especially the legacy companies, I think they've been playing a catch up, right? So I think it's always, and I was reading a blog and I'll share that with you maybe after the call that they were talking about why security is not a great business to be in. I think it was kind of cynical, sort of an article, but I think the point that this person was trying to make is there's always a catch up that's happening in the cybersecurity space because the technology evolution is so quick that you're always catching up to secure, I would say, the controls and putting in the right sort of measures. And with the evolution of AI and things like quantum, I think it's going to become more and more difficult for companies to be able to play the catch-up game because, like you rightly said, you need to have a Tor browser. You go on the dark web, and there's a lot of services for hire. They you can hire and just for fun, or be it an actual criminal intent, or we see a lot of the state-sponsored attacks as well happening. So depending on which category you fall in, I think the motivations are different, but the end result is actually a huge disruption. And we have seen networks where the entire core network has been held to ransomware. We have seen networks in Australia, for example, which was public news, like Optus, which had a massive cybersecurity breach last year. They had a configuration issue with the CEO had to step down. So cybersecurity, I think in the traditional way, people used to think about ROI and okay, if I want to invest in cybersecurity, what kind of return am I getting? But I think right now it's been linked to really your top line. It's been linked to your reputation. It's been linked to your, I would say, compliance, right? Because more and more countries are requiring these critical network infrastructure providers to really report any breaches that happen to the regulator, right? And funny enough, there was a breach that happened in one of the domains in the US, I believe. I need to look that up. But where they actually demanded ransomware and the company refused. And they actually went to the regulator and said, by the way, we hacked this company and they have now reported it, right? So you see all these funny things going on right now where you really need to be on top of your game. And like you said, with quantum, all the encryption that we've been used to in the past, do we need to have a complete fresh look on how we interlink this data sovereignty and link it to governance, right? Because I think that's going to become more and more important as we kind of go to a more strictly regulated kind of a space where the governments are becoming more serious. and the regulators are really enforcing these companies to really up their game.
Absolutely. You mentioned something that I think is fascinating. I don't think I've had anyone on the show to talk about this, and this is critical infrastructure. So, because telecom is critical infrastructure, you all are subject to a lot more regulation on top of the stuff that all of us have to do in regulatory spaces. But what is your thought about how you all are dealing with trying to stay ahead of the curve because you are in this highly regulated space?
Sure. So to give you a bit of perspective, the way the networks are secure is actually a three-layered approach, right? So when we talk about security, we ask our customers to think about security as a three-tier approach. So we have the regulations, which are 3GPP, for example, which is a third generation partnership project, as linked with GSMA, and they define what sets of features need to be rolled out in these networks, be it 4G, 5G, and beyond. And they have releases that come in every year or so, and more that defines this to a very level of detail. Then there's every vendor, like Nokia. We have about 200 plus products. Every product goes through a process called DevSec, or Design for Security, which means security is embedded as part of a development process to make sure that the basic hardening is done. And the last level is that when these network, I would say, components are shipped out and deployed in an actual, production zone or production setup, they need to be secured, right? So basic things you used to have in IT, like how do you segment the traffic? How do you define zoning? How do you define the user control plane? I would say segregation. How do you make sure the data is secured, both at rest in like zero transit? So that requires all these mission critical networks to be able to have an end-to-end design for security. And that's where we see often a lot of gaps because of multiple reasons. So despite of the regulations, every vendor implements the 3GPP a bit differently. And a lot of things are left to optional, which really opens the threat landscape to potential attackers or hackers. So as these CSPs or the critical communication providers are deploying the networks, there's an absolute need to make sure they have an expert who really understands the end-to-end security, the regulatory framework when it comes to what has been defined from standards, and for that respective country in terms of what is their local regulation and how does that fit into the global frameworks like NIST Cybersecurity Framework or NISAS or GSMA, and pick the best of breed to make sure that we do a compliance check, we do a baseline, and we put in a risk strategy that fits in with their short to medium and long-term goals, right? So I think that is where we see a lot of work being done. I think that's a major part of my job is to be able to educate the customers that this is a very, very important area for them to focus and how we can support in building this end-to-end security view where it's not a question of if they are hacked, but when they are hacked, what is the response strategy? Do they have the right controls in place to minimize the damages, and how would they recover? So that is kind of what we sit down with these key customers and develop a long to medium term strategy, which brings into the frameworks, which brings into the regulation, and brings in our expertise to be able to put all those three things together and give them a security design, which is not only a default off the shelf, but customized to their specific environments.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I want to talk about AI. So, artificial intelligence has completely taken over the conversation about almost any technology, and everyone thinks they're doing AI right now. How is AI impacting you in a cybersecurity or privacy sense?
So I think we're seeing tip of the iceberg on that, Debbie. I mean, I've been following a lot of influencers like yourself on LinkedIn. I am part of a review course that I'm doing for Stanford on ethical AI. I could not join that course because they were probably full, but they were kind enough to let me review the content. And I think few of people we know in common are part of that course, which are talking about ethics and AI, which is a very, very important topic. I think we have taken for granted this uptake for IoT. I think we are doing the same for the AI as well. So it's got two aspects, right? I mean, one is for people like myself or you, we want to use AI and these machine learning models to improve our productivity, where often then more we may find ourselves compelled to putting some documents or some text onto these models to get some insights or run some tests without being assured on how the data is going to be used, right? That's the biggest question. And secondly, for the enterprises like telecoms, which are rolling out these AI tools for their own productivity, like automation, and how do they ensure that the data that they are using is going to be really kept for themselves or it's not going to be shared with other companies in the similar domain? How do you make sure there's no data poisoning happening? How do you make sure there's no data biases, right? So some of the frameworks that I've looked at, I think NIST did a great one recently called the NIST, I would say, Risk Management Framework, or the NIST RMF. We have seen in the past couple of weeks, actually, a lot of these regulations coming from the White House. I think, Biden did something. We've seen something in the UK as well. Regulations are catching up, but do we really believe that the technology would follow the regulations? I think, how do you enforce that when a company is embracing a certain AI tool to automate certain use cases, they are being forced to comply and run an assessment based on a framework? So I think that becomes a question that while it's important to have free hand as you're deploying technology, especially AI, for your use cases or for your own productivity, how do you make sure you do it responsibly? And I think we are still collectively looking to find an answer to that question because a lot of people are still either two sides, which one side is, okay, we need heavy regulation, nothing goes past before we pass this. And the second side is probably say, we don't care about it. We are going to go ahead. We are going to deploy these models. We are going to make them more efficient. We are going to have what we saw with Gemini coming in, which is now the context of the video and the voice and all that. But how is that data being stored? How is that being used? I mean, that's a big question mark. And I think somewhere this needs to be checked. And I think there has to be sort of a dialogue which needs to happen between the public and the private companies to see where do we draw the line. Is okay, it's a great tool to have, but are we ready to really roll it out to mass public? I mean, do we have the right data privacy controls that make sure that the data is not leaked to other users or companies? And I think the same applies for the enterprises, right? When they are embracing these tools and technologies, how do they make sure that their data is secure? How do they know that these tools are really ethical and there are no biases built into it? So long debate, but I think in short, I see it as being a catch-up to the technology that are being rolled out and the frameworks while there. And I've seen a lot of them. I'm sure you see probably every day a new framework being posted. But how good is that framework if it's not being enforced? I think that's the question I'm still struggling to answer for myself is how do you enforce that? And I think that's going to be $1 million question.
I agree. I think people misunderstand regulation. So regulation always, unfortunately, is the result of, or almost always the result of something bad that happened already, right? So regulation can't really keep up with technology. And I think with advancements in AI, what we're going to start to see is more that gap between regulation and what's happening in technology is only going to get bigger because the innovation is happening a lot more rapidly. So it's like hard to keep up. But then flip side of that, I feel like if there's regulation, if there are frameworks and things like that, it really needs to hone in on the harm to humans, right? Because to me, that is the key issue. Like, how harmful is it to someone's privacy? How harmful is it to their security if X, Y, and Z happens? And so to me, if we think about it in a harm way, focusing on that human centricity, you can get to the bottom of the issue, I feel, and it makes it something that could be more evergreen as opposed to us playing a cat and mouse game, right, with regulation. Like, oh, well, we don't have to do that because it's not in the regulation. But it's like, well,
precisely.
Well, this harms your customer. And so how can you, to me, this has a bottom line impact in some way because customers will find other services that they want to use if they feel like your organization isn't really taking their safety and security or privacy seriously. What do you think?
100%, Debbie. I mean, to look at an example, what happened during this whole surveillance that started post 9/11, right? I mean, there was a whole talk about to what level you would put surveillance versus it would impact civil liberty, right? So I think similar things were happening now in terms of to what level you need to regulate this without really inhibiting on some of the rights that people have. And I think people over the years have become more and more mature and tech savvy and more aware of their rights in terms of what is out there publicly available, owned by these companies, and what is being used to monetize. So, I mean, as they say, with all these great tools that we have or the great services we have, I mean, if you're not paying for a product, then you are actually a product yourself, right? So, I mean, we use all social media, LinkedIn, and similar the tools, and we know that we post out a lot of data, which some of it's great, but again, we don't know how the data is being used, right? And the same applies for these other tools that we currently have access to. And I mean, my God, I mean, we see about 20 AI tools coming every 10 minutes, right? It's even hard to keep up to kind of try and test out what these tools are. So what kind of worries me more is our next generation as they embrace and they see this happening as naturally, like to a certain extent, we have seen in the case of IoT and M2M is how do they perceive their data privacy? I mean, are they really going to be as vigilant and as aware? We hope that they would be, but that's a whole different debate on, the Gen Z and, how they would take up this. But I absolutely agree with you. What you said is the importance of regulating things like AI, making sure we are doing it in a way which doesn't inhibit advancement of technology, at the same time making people aware that they have options, that they always have options to opt out or to limit the data that is being shared on their behalf. I think that has to happen. And I think that has to happen very, very quickly, because otherwise we'd probably be in this never-ending cycle where we're exposed to these technology advancements without really realizing how much value we are giving away, or being a product of these technologies, we're not really getting a fair hand.
Yeah. I love the fact that I talk to technologists all over the world like you and me, and I've not heard one person say, let's just innovate and forget about the responsible use. Everyone that I talk to, regardless of where they all are talking about doing it responsibly because they understand what the harm could be if we do it the wrong way.
Absolutely.
If it were the world according to you, Moiz, and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for either privacy or cybersecurity anywhere in the world, even if it were technology, regulation, or human behavior?
Right. I mean, so I think that's a great question and probably a great note for us to end this. Despite of all the challenges, I think we as technologists are very optimistic on what technology has to bring to the table, right? The a great sort of advancements it has brought already, and the great, I would say, new use cases in healthcare and fintech and smart cities and multiple other domains that would come in the future. And we are seeing a lot of them realize in front of our eyes. I think in an ideal world, we probably need to see a very strong public-private partnerships that would promote funding cybersecurity grades of the critical infrastructures, like the work that I work in, right? With companies like ourselves can be very strongly embedded in rolling out these networks in a secure way, right? Where we have technology neutral frameworks that these governments can put into place. And basically a very strong collaboration and, commitment to things like resilience, that we can enjoy these technologies safely and, in a way that it makes it reliable, it makes it innovative, to be able to roll them out in a secure way. And of course, in the bigger context of things, we have a prosperous digital economies and societies of scale that can really be replicated across multiple regions and geographies. I think in short, that'd be my vision on how I see this somehow panning out.
I love that. I love it. I agree. I think that resilience is really, really important. And I know innovation will not stop. So we know that's definitely going to go forward, but being able to do it in responsible, ethical ways is very, very key to people being able to really adopt these things going forward. So, yeah. Thank you so much for joining us from Dubai. It's really early here in Chicago, but I'm happy to have this call with you. So it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation and would love to host you in Dubai probably follow up face-to-face dialogue, see a bit of what this beautiful country has to offer. So looking forward to that.
Oh, I would love to come to Dubai.
I'll take you up on that.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you,
Bye.
Debbie. Take care. Bye-bye.